The RCMP Heritage Centre is a not-for-profit charitable organisation mandated to share the story of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. This is one of those stories, part of your heritage.
I grew up near RCMP. My father retired as a commanding officer of Quebec, and coincidentally I retired from that position too back in '95. And I essentially grew up, you know, hearing all the stories, the great adventures, rum running in New Brunswick and whatnot. And these stories always regaled me and sort of often got my imagination going. But I had really no notion what I was going to do with my life as I was growing up. Essentially, I was born in Moncton, but my father had married an Acadian in New Brunswick and was stationed in Moncton. He was actually a Quebecer that had been sent there in 1932 when the force took over from the provincial police that had been discharged for reasons of corruption. So my first memories really of growing up in Montreal is in Quebec, which is, of course, you know, 𝑇ℎ𝑒 And when I was around 12 years old, I believe, my father got transferred to, my father and my family, we got transferred to New Brunswick. And here I could barely speak English at the time. I knew a little bit of English to say hello, goodbye, and that was about it. And we arrived in New Brunswick, and there was not a lot of French facilities in those days, so my parents dumped me in an Irish Catholic school where I did learn English with a pointer. I see good nuns, and the good nuns taught me a little bit of English while I was there. We were in Fredericton for about 4 or 5 years, and then we got transferred to Manitoba, and continued my studies in English. And I graduated from Kelvin High School in grade 11 in Manitoba. I decided to become a non-student in grade 12 and flunked out. And my father was transferred back to Montreal, and I was wandering around trying to figure out what I was going to do. And suddenly it dawned on me, you know, why not try the RCMP and just see what it was like? And because I'd reached a stage there where one of these fuzzy periods in my life where, you know, school didn't interest me a lot anymore. I just hadn't done that well the last year by my own foolishness. So I knew I needed something there to sort of kind of get me a little more disciplined and organized. So I decided to join the RCMP. By the way, my father swore me in, which was sort of traditional. I think they probably still do that today. And of course, I ended up in Regina, Saskatchewan, and in January. January the 24th is when I arrived there, 1963. And I can remember, geez, once I settled into the barracks and looked outside, I couldn't figure out, what am I doing here? Snow was blowing. I was freezing to death, and you know, about a week before, I'd gone to the Montreal Forum to see a hockey game, and then I'd gone down Crescent Street to have a beer, and I thought, holy, what a shock this was. So anyway, I worked my way through it, and you know, I suppose like most people, you know, it was a rough grind. You know, I was 19, 20, immature, you know, needed to grow up, and what it did, it really gave me some structure. And I had pretty well decided that I was going to stay 2 years and go back to school, but I ended up in New Brunswick, and I kind of enjoyed the work. And I was familiar with the RCMP in New Brunswick. My father had been there, and I used to hang around with members of the RCMP when I was 16, 17, and I even played hockey with them. They had a rink, outdoor rink. I used to play with the puck, shoot pool in the barrack rooms, and so I had a lot of sort of basic information on how they operate, you know, and these individuals seemed to be pretty happy, so this is what kind of inspired me to go in the force. I went to New Brunswick, and I was familiar with contract policing, and I you know, if we were sitting here with 20, 30 members of the force, we'd all be telling basically the same stories, you know, the high-speed chases, the dance hall fights, and these sort of things. But you know, if I was going to single out a few things that really sort of had an impact on me and affected me I'd been transferred to 𝐻𝑒𝑟𝑖𝑡 because of there had been a high instance of fatalities on the highways. In New Brunswick in those days, the roads were poor and people drove too fast, and there was often a lot of alcohol involved. So I was sent there from Chatham on highway patrol. And I had two incidents that really struck me and just burned in my memory. I had two young women die in my arms as a result of serious accidents, begging me to help them, and there's not a thing I could do. It really, those really made me realize, you know, how short life was and how important the work that we were doing was in order to try to keep the population safe. The other case that I was involved in involved a woman that was mentally ill, that was armed and had been shooting at cars going by, and I was close by, so I rolled in with my police car and an individual I was working at, and we got help from other places, and we had surrounded the area. And there was a senior NCO trying to talk her out with the old megaphone and whatnot. So while this was going on, we noticed that she would walk out of the house maybe 40, 50 yards with her back to the house. And I was sort of on the side here, so what I did is I snuck into the house and I put myself up against a wall. And when she came into the house, I was able to grab the rifle with my left hand and bring my hand up, and she pulled the trigger, and it caught me just in the fat of between my thumb and my finger. And so anyway, I screamed for help. We got her under control. And I pulled the lever on the rifle, and the shells started popping up. Oh, I was scared to death. I had convinced myself that there was no bullets in the gun, and that's why I snuck in there. But it totally terrified me. But mind you, I got over it and continued. Eventually, I ended up in Montreal. I had about 7-8 years service, and I was in the security service. And this was just maybe a couple of months after the Cross kidnapping and the Laporte murder. You know, Montreal was like a circus in that period of time. You know, with the anti-war movement, there was extremist groups that were operating. I ended up working on a series of extremist groups that involved the Black Panthers up from the United States, where I worked closely with the FBI, running informants and technical surveillance against these individuals, and passing information on to the various authorities. We were fortunate there was really not any serious incidents that occurred in Canada. But we were able to keep close surveillance on them until they were back into the States, and we organized ourselves with immigration to bar them from coming back into the country, because these particular individuals were, no matter how noble the cause might have been, with the whole civil rights movement, you know, we could not accept this kind of violence. The other area that I worked in during that period of time was I was transferred onto the Middle East desk right after the Munich massacre, and it was very similar, the same thing. It was doing all types of operations, both through informants, surveillance, technical, including human surveillance and technical surveillance, to keep track of those elements that were suspect or belonging to certain groups out of the Middle East. I did that for probably about 3-4 years, especially leading into the Olympics, where again I was heavily involved in some major operations in order to make sure that we had assets into critical places within that particular area. Now, I can't go too far with some of the techniques and whatnot we were doing, but this was extremely fascinating work that what this work inspired me to do was to start studying. And in Montreal, there was Sir George William, and now became Concordia University. Was well geared for adult education, so I went back and started to study. So I studied various political organizations, Middle East religions, a whole gambit of areas covering politics, human behavior, and whatnot. The end result of all these efforts, the RCMP at that time gave me 2 years to finish off my degree, so I picked up a 4-year degree from Concordia. About the time I graduated, the MacDonald Commission blew up, and I was transferred to Ottawa to work with the RCMP defense or with examining the files, helping people to testify in court. Before the Commission of Inquiry, I spent a total of 3 years. And those a total of 3 years doing that. What that allowed me to do is to examine how security services work from the top floor, right from the top to the bottom. It was like getting a PhD in intelligence, if you will. At the same time, I was also we had we had several commissions of inquiry going. The second one that I was dealing with was the Cable Commission in Montreal. That really, by this time, the Parti québécois was in power, and you know, there was a concerted effort really to bring disgrace on the RCMP, way beyond any of the activities that they may have been involved that were not maybe according to Hoyle. So there, my majority of my time was in trying to keep them keep this commission on the straight and narrow. There was a decision that came out of the Supreme Court that no provincial body could investigate the RCMP. This was up to the MacDonald Commission to do. However, they had the authority to look at criminal activity by anybody, including policemen. So my function there, my duty there, and being the only real French-speaking person on the task force, was to work with our lawyers and keep them within a narrow scope, which lasted this time. That lasted another 3 years of my life. Again, very extremely interesting times, but like the Chinese curse, it's not always great to live in interesting times. From there, I went to the Prime Minister's detail, where Prime Minister Trudeau was in power. I was responsible for his security and his foreign travel for about 3 years, until actually he finally resigned as Prime Minister. So that I traveled with him outside of the country, and when he was in the country, the local units looked after him. And what I did is I did visiting dignitaries from other countries, presidents or leaders that were some under serious threat, others were fairly routine to do. Near the end of my time with Trudeau, I was approached to go to law school. And I got my law degree, and the punishment I had to do that for getting my law degree and giving me this great holiday, which was the hardest work I've ever done in my life. I was appointed as an adjudicator to hear discipline cases where members were charged under the RCMP Act for various breaches of misconduct. I would say that it was probably one of the most interesting and probably the most difficult jobs that I've done in my life. I would say my life, because here here I had the career of individuals in my hands, and most of these cases were fairly serious breaches. However, you know, it was to try to distinguish between those cases where there was an error in judgment, contrasted with those cases where there was a real integrity issue. And many of those cases, the commanding officers of the divisions had viewed that these individuals should be fired if they had been convicted of these particular breaches. Now, and the other thing too is that, you know, you really start to reflect on this and it's only human to say, look, you know, if I find some individual should be given a second chance, I mean, you know, there's always a risk in doing that. And also, I mean, how are people going to see me after? Is my loyalty going to be questioned? Now, I got to say that this was thoughts in my own mind. I never had any pressure put on me. But, you know, and then there are a number of cases where I gave people second chances. Other people I dismissed. And I worked with maybe 4 or 5 individuals that were doing that, and I would say that the majority of our time debating was about those issues. I mean, where do you draw that line and say, look, this person deserves a second chance. If I allow this person to stay in the RCMP, it's going to be a major, serious hindrance to the organization. Now, in some cases, the line was easy. You know, we had certain individuals that were caught trafficking in narcotics and whatnot. Well, that was easy to make those decisions. But there were a number of borderline decisions. And the borderline ones, too, also often dealt with individuals that had worked in jobs under severe stress, where maybe they should have been taken out earlier. And you know, it was established clearly that they had some real, you know, solid records. And I'd often rely on the staff sergeants in the operational divisions that would come in. Whenever I saw a couple of staff sergeants coming in to testify on the character of an individual, I always took that very, very seriously. Because as I grew up in the force, I realized often that the backbone of the organization is the constable, but also supported by these staff sergeants. So anyway, I worked our way through, and in some cases I fired individuals or recommended individuals for discharge, and others I gave a second chance to. Well, my personal experience has been that the individuals that investigated members for misdeeds were fair and impartial. They were good and solid investigators. But I think it's a question of image or perception, really. Perception is probably the better word for that. And you know, like the cases, I mean, these cases also are subject to overview by outside bodies. I mean, there was a commission that would look at cases where we convicted to review these cases. Sometimes they would reduce a dismissal to you know, a fine and not throw the person out. Other times they confirm that they fully agree, and then there was always the federal courts that could you know, be petitioned to hear a case. However, I think though in certain cases sometimes it's smart to get maybe an outside police force to conduct the inquiry, or at least that perception is gone. Well, what I did is I became a superintendent in that area, and I was transferred over to the unit. As you probably know, and most people know today, that the security service that I was in was dismantled, and there was a new agency formed with a lot of these individuals. A number of individuals stayed, and what I went into at this stage is what components would be built in the RCMP to deal with the criminal side of activities that involve national security. And I think part of the reason why I was selected is that I'd spent 10 years in the security service, and also I had the experience of the McDonald Commission, and so I had a great deal of familiarity as how it split, how the government wanted the security service to work, and what was the role of the RCMP within that let's say sphere of work. And you know, it was not always an easy individuals. You have 2 turfs and different perspectives, and we had developed mechanisms to try to negotiate, you know, reasonable accommodations. So both the informants that the CSIS were developing were well protected if we needed to proceed with some criminal cases. Also, at that time, I still knew a lot of the key actors over on the other side, and I got along well with them. They knew I understood their position, and we found ways to work things out. And with time, you know, I'm sure things have improved. I mean, I've lost track now. I've been away from that particular type of work for, I hear stories, but that's hearsay. Yeah. So, I mean, basically that was my function. And while I was there too, that whole area was restructured to further refine the operations role, the RCMP role with working with the new security service, if you will. And I led the study, and we brought about a number of changes in that area. And from my understanding is that there's been many more changes, especially after September the 11th. I think the gates opened up more, and the RCMP was given more authority to delve into these crimes, these political crimes, if you will. And I think they've even formed some form of task force working together. My first command position as a CO was, I was promoted to assistant commissioner and became a CO, was A Division. I was there for about 3 years, and it was an interesting experience because there you're really close to political problems. You know, we had to look after all the embassy, responsible for protecting the embassies, 24 Sussex Drive, Governor General's residence, and they even had brought the people that travel with these individuals into A Division. So that was a fun area to work in. The other thing too is we got hit with the big financial cuts too, which meant massive restructuring and reducing numbers and trying to figure out where we could do the less damage to our operations, and yet meet the deadlines that we had to meet for cutting positions. And of course, the RCMP is a labor-intensive organization, so it involves people. So when if you're going to do any type of cutting, the operational money ain't very much. So you've got to reduce your numbers. And of course, as you probably know, there was a system that was evolved where you eliminated a position. A person had a choice to take a cash out, which was about a year's pay and leave, or look to be reaccommodated, and we'd attempt to reaccommodate somewhere in the country. We froze training too, so that we could. That helped too to reduce to meet our budget demand. So that was 3 years. 3 years was my time as a CO was taken up with this, and also finding a new building to move into. I stopped being an operator and started working with a pencil.
The boring stuff.
Well, I mean, you know, I had to deal with other police forces, and you know, there was a lot of building relationships, task force. I started getting exchanges done between our members and municipal police forces to kind of cross-pollinate them, do unique experience, and develop links between these organizations. And there's a big social responsibility that goes with these jobs too. That you're cutting ribbons and going to community things, visiting embassy birthdays and national holidays and that. It was a busy 3 years. There was a time there was my father, myself, and my brother Clem, who you met in Depot, was an instructor. We were in, and then my youngest brother, my third brother, went to the surveillance teams as a civilian member for about 5 years, and then he went off and decided to become rich rather than be a poor pensioner like I am. If I learned one big thing in the RCMP at a personal level, it's the story of human growth. I joined the RCMP. To some extent, there's no doubt that it's the knowledge I'd acquired, my family connections and whatnot, that it would have sort of made me make that decision in that particular area. But you know, and I'm not a person that worries too much about the future. I still don't do now. I wasn't. To me, it was a bit of an experiment to see how I would how I would feel about it. And to me, what I found is that it was an organization that had so many facets that allowed me to grow really grow as a human being. And the other thing too is that I am also convinced that if you want a career in an organization, you have to make certain personal sacrifices. I've got some very good friends that have retired as corporals, some as sergeants, and they just accepted the fact that they were quite content with that. I still visit them when I go down in New Brunswick, and they made those decisions. So I think it's really up to an individual to decide what they want to do with themselves. And with me, the more I pushed, the more I worked, the more doors opened up for me, and opportunities to get a better education and whatnot. So to me, that's really it. But today, what I find the biggest challenges today, and I've got kids, that they're working, both are working, and they got kids of their own and trying to balance their lives. I mean, I didn't have those extra pressures. So I think today, individuals that join the RCMP that really want careers are really in a tough spot if they're part of this, you know, where shared responsibilities and whatnot. I don't know how they do it, to be honest with you. I mean, the other thing too, I really believe is that, you know, I was a person for my time. These individuals are a person for this time, and I'm sure that, you know, they'll figure out ways to survive and make out the same way as I did. I have faith that they're maybe even they're probably more smarter than I am, because I work too much. One of the things I always thought was important, I feel was important, is that it gave you an opportunity to make a difference. And I think that I firmly believe that I did make a difference in a number of areas. In some of the communities I worked in, like for instance in 𝐻𝑒𝑟𝑖𝑡, when I arrived there were 32 fatalities the year before. When I left, the last year I was there, we were down to 3 fatalities. So, I mean, I think I made a difference. I mean, I've helped young people in the force along the way when I had more experience and brought them along, and some of them have done very well in the force. You know, and I worked in Montreal again, caught up in my last command was Montreal, caught up in a major restructuring, and I think we brought, even though despite the fact we had to do a lot of cutting, I think I helped in bringing the division, making the division more efficient and more capable, and performing its mandate in that particular province. I mean, I even was able to work with the Quebec government, which was a separatist government, that we'd all participate together in the fight for law enforcement and forget politics. So I mean, this is to me is that I think I had the type of personality that I really needed to make a difference, and this is what basically drove me through my career in the RCMP.